Round 13 of the Premier League is coming up this weekend, and it's time to preview and predict every single game of this game week, starting off with Brentford taking on Burnley at home. And as I've mentioned previously, I reckon that Burnley currently are the worst team in the entire Premier League, even though the table doesn't quite say so, because they're, of course, 8 points ahead of Wolves. But the performances just haven't been impressive from Burnley. The win against Sunderland at home stands out, but that was like a couple of months ago now. And other than that, it has looked really, really poor, I believe, anyways. And I think this will be comfortable for Brentford, to be honest, even though Burnley can make it hard, especially when they're going away and they just park the bus. But I actually think, even though they got a bit of criticism for that previous game against Brighton, I actually believe that they showed a lot of quality there. And when you lower the opposition from Brighton away to Burnley at home, I just can't see anything else than a Brentford win here, to be honest. And just one piece of, what can you say, criticism, I suppose, towards Brentford this season is that they are better against better teams, they seem to be, because they like a bit less possession and go on the counter. And of course, that's not going to be a game plan against Burnley. But I think that's also doing Keith Andrews a bit of a disservice because they have shown that they can actually do very well against teams that don't have a lot of possession, as they beat Manchester United like a month ago. So I suspect Brentford to come out with an adequate game plan here and beat Burnley 2-0. Next up, we have a game that perhaps is a bit more interesting than maybe it should be. It's Manchester City taking on Leeds at home. And the reason I say that is, of course, as I mentioned before, Leeds have had a quite decent start to the season. Maybe not with the results, but the way they're playing is very promising. And they do create quite a lot of chances, more than most of us would have predicted coming into the season. And of course, the elephant in the room here is when we watch the form of Manchester City. That Newcastle performance, even though there were some glimpses of the quality of Manchester City, it just wasn't impressive at all. Even though I did predict a Newcastle win, so I shouldn't be surprised. But I actually would have expected it to be because of the fact that Newcastle would turn up, which I mean they probably did, but it wasn't that good of a performance from Newcastle. I know that's crazy to say when they beat Manchester City, but it was just like Manchester City looked like they've swapped shirts with the other club from Manchester and just didn't step up to the plate. But then when they faced Leverkusen, although they are a very good team, Leverkusen, I expected it to be quite comfortable there, and they went on to lose 2-0 at home against Leverkusen. And of course, Leverkusen are decent, but the level should be a bit higher for Manchester City. However, the obvious thing that you might be thinking is yes, they did lose to Leverkusen. However, they did rotate quite a bit. And that's the reason why I am going to go with a Manchester City win, purely because when we look at the side that Pep put out against Leverkusen. I mean, that's another conversation for another time, right? But I don't know how he can like just let that game go and think that his reserves will beat Leverkusen. Maybe like 3 years ago when they were in their prime. Not anymore though. But it does mean that a lot of the key players for City will be well rested, and I do believe that they will be up for it come Saturday. So I'm going with the 3-1 Manchester City win. Moving on to a very interesting game, in my opinion. It's Sunderland taking on Bournemouth at home. And I've seen a few pundits and people on social media sticking their necks out and predicting a quite comfortable Bournemouth win. And of course, that might not be a bad prediction, especially considering that Semenyo is most likely back here, and we all know how decent he is at the minute. But I don't really like people underestimating Sunderland, to be honest. I know that if you look at expected points and goals, they should be a bit lower in the table. However, football is not played on paper, and Sunderland have a really good ability to just claw out some results from a few games. And it has happened a bit more this season than for me to accept that it's just luck. So I actually think that comes down to skill and mentality in these players, and that shouldn't be underestimated. And I also find it a bit funny when people expect Bournemouth to make this look easy, which of course they can. But when Arsenal go to the Stadium of Light and drop points, is it really that fair to predict Bournemouth to just cruise a win there? Perhaps not. I don't think Sunderland should be underestimated. Of course, Bournemouth, all in all, are maybe at a higher level, at least in my opinion. It might be controversial, but Sunderland do have the spirit, especially playing at home. Like I said, most people I've heard have predicted a Bournemouth win. I'm actually going to go with a draw here and predict a 1-1. Next up, we have a matchup between two very intriguing teams, in my opinion. It's Everton taking on Newcastle at home. And to start off with Everton here, of course, they got that win at Old Trafford on Monday night, where the big controversy, if you haven't seen it, I guess you have, it was Idrissa Gana Gueye having a bit of a disagreement, to say the least, with Michael Keane, and it ended up with Gana Gueye just slapping him across the face and getting sent off for slapping his own teammate, which is something I've personally almost never seen before, at least not in the Premier League at this top level. However, they did go on and win that game, and I want to give Everton a bit of credit, even though I'm not a fan of David Moyes at all. The team did fight, and that's about as much as I'm gonna give him because, of course, the atmosphere going to Old Trafford and winning, even though it's not as hard as it was in the Sir Alex days, of course, nowhere near. It's still impressive with that hostile atmosphere. But the performance for Everton, you can't expect much more when they're one man down for basically the entire game. But if we look at the stats, they played very, very poorly, I have to say. And the reason I bring this up is just because that's not the first time I've seen that this season. The results, even though they sometimes manage to get the result, it's not always impressive. And as a matter of fact, it's very rarely impressive. And that's no coincidence. That's David Moyes for you. Just a quick little look at the stats here. Where do they have them there? Stats. I mean, they had 30% possession and zero point 0.2 expected goals. One shot on target, which they scored. I mean, that's all you're going to have to do. I get the argument that even teams like Arsenal and City and Liverpool, all teams can have a scrappy win. But when that's your main theme, it's not too promising. And of course, Everton are better at home and have managed to get a few decent results there. But Newcastle is quite a tough ask, and I am a bit intrigued why a lot of people are going with an Everton win here because Newcastle last time out against Marseille started the game really well, but then went on to lose it against Aubameyang, a very slow and, in my opinion, finished version. Scored two quick goals against them. That's not a good look. And Nick Pope was under all critique there. Will Eddie Howe make the big decision to drop him for perhaps Ramsdale? I don't believe so. Speaking to a few Newcastle fans, it doesn't sound like that's the way he's inclined. But I think that's what he has to do and just start rotating because they are picking up uh, too many injuries at the minute, in my opinion, Newcastle. And the players who aren't injured just don't look as fresh. I mean, when we look at players like Tonali and Guimares, like a year ago, they were two of the best midfielders in the Premier League, and now they look way, way beyond it. So difficult one. This I'm still considering what I'm gonna go with. But I draw some confidence from that Newcastle result against Manchester City. Of course, that's at home, and they are incredibly much better at home than away. All in all, I'm just gonna be a bit cowardly here and actually predict a 1-1 draw. And lastly, on the Saturday is the London Derby where Tottenham take on Fulham at home. And of course, Tottenham are very big betting favorites here. I don't really agree with that, to be honest. Tottenham managed to score 3 past PSG on Wednesday, and that is quite impressive, even though they conceded 5. But to concede 5 goals against PSG, there are a lot of good teams who would do that, to be honest. But I do worry that that game against PSG away will have taken a lot out of their players. Of course, Christian Romero is suspended, and they have a quite significant injury list as well, Tottenham. But the players who are actually fit, a bit like with Newcastle, are they gonna be as sharp? It's hard for me to actually believe that because it was a very, very intense game against PSG. Fulham, on the other hand, have had a whole week rest, and I actually believe that they will come into this derby looking very sharp, unlike what I predict Tottenham to. And I am a big fan of Marco Silva. The start of the season was very underwhelming, but they have managed to pick themselves up a bit, to be honest. Even though they only won 1-0 against Sunderland, they did create a lot more and actually dominated that. So it should have been a bit more than a 1-0 there. The way lost against Everton, of course, it isn't impressive. But before that, beating Wolves 3-0, I mean, it hasn't been too bad. And what I draw some confidence for here as well when I predict Fulham to get the result and not get beat is the fact that when I watch them, they have looked good. I think they do deserve a bit more. They've created quite a bit, but the numbers for expected goals and expected points might not be that high. But it's more on the eye test for me that I actually have some belief in this Fulham team. And that combined with the fact that I do think that Tottenham will be tired and they have just a, can you call it a capacity or a skill? I don't know because it's negative, but they just seem to underperform, especially in these kind of games. Remember that they got the last second draw at home against Wolves previously in the season. And also interesting is that Tottenham this season have been a lot worse playing at home than going away. So I actually think that Fulham will close this game out, and I'm going to predict a 2-1 away win for Fulham here. Moving on to the Sunday, we actually have an early game here. It's Crystal Palace taking on Manchester United at home. And as I covered, Manchester United lost to a 10-man Everton side at home at Old Trafford. Ruben Amorim coming out and blasting his squad, should I say, after that game, saying that he was up for it, the fans were up for it, but the players weren't. And if you know Manchester United over the last few years, that is one of the biggest issues, actually. The players just sometimes don't turn up. We know that they are capable of quite incredible results, but they are also capable to not barely create a single chance at home against a 10-man Everton side. And that is concerning for Manchester United. Will Ruben Amorim rotate a lot here? The rumors are that he won't, and if you look at his previous games with Manchester United, he has been very, very slow to rotate, even when the results hasn't gone his way, and the players seem to be lacking a bit of form. He still backs the same old players, and I guess some people would argue that that's good to show faith, but you also need to be able to give him a rest and get the players on the bench a chance. So the lineup will dictate a bit of how I predict on the day, but an early one here. I do favor Crystal Palace, as does the bookies, of course. However, they did play away against Strasbourg on the Thursday night, and now an early Sunday game. That's a very quick turnaround. And what's a bit interesting is that a lot of key players actually played in that game, like Munoz, Pino, Mateta, Sar. A lot of their best players played almost 90 minutes. So will they be a bit worn out? And have they managed to actually recover fully? I can't imagine that they have. However, I do think that it's going to be enough to beat Manchester United. I don't even know if they will concede here at Crystal Palace, and I'm going to go with a 1-0 Crystal Palace win. Next up, we have a Midlands derby where Aston Villa take on Wolves. And I actually think that it's going to be quite comfortable for Aston Villa. That might be famous last words here, but I am impressed by Rob Edwards previously in his career. I think he's a good coach, but I also think that he's a coach who needs a lot of time to instill his philosophy into a squad. And of course, like all other coaches, he needs his own transfers and be able to work with his own players as well. So to, expect Rob Edwards to have some kind of instant impact. I think it's a bit harsh, to be honest. And Una Emery has been at Aston Villa for years now. The squad has actually picked up a bit of pace now. A few very good results, of course. They beat Young Boys. And maybe, though, their disadvantage here is a bit like I just mentioned with Palace, the fact that they played on the Thursday night, but they played at home, so they wouldn't have had to travel, and they managed to rotate quite a bit as well. And Malen actually scored 2 goals, which will be quite positive, of course, for them as well, since Watkins is a bit out of form. So maybe an inform Malen will start here instead. And I'm gonna go with 2-0 Aston Villa win here come Sunday. Moving on to the mighty Sean Dyche and his Nottingham Forest. I mean, he's just doing a bit of a miracle, isn't he? Beating Liverpool 3-0 at Anfield is incredible with that squad at his disposal. Where do you start? I don't want to hear, by the way, anything of this. Oh, Liverpool are trash. Of course, they're going to beat them because Liverpool recently beat Real Madrid at home. So for Shandaish to go to Anfield and not only keep a clean sheet, but score three past them is incredibly impressive. Then, of course, they won on Thursday 3-0 in the Europa League. Let's see if they rotated. He actually managed to rotate the squad a bit as well. And Hudson Odoi is back now, back fit again. I actually like the chances of Forest here. Although I just remember there that they struggled a bit against Bournemouth, and Brighton and Bournemouth are not too dissimilar. Of course, Brighton have picked up quite decent form as well, so this can be a tough one to predict. I'm a bit torn, but I am very impressed by the discipline that Sean Dyche always manages to instill into his team, and I can't see them concede more than 1 goal to this Brighton side. So most likely might be a 1-1 draw in my opinion. But I'm just gonna trust Sean Dyche. When you can beat Liverpool 3-0 away, you can beat Brighton at home, and I'm gonna predict a 2-1 win to Forest. And then Liverpool, who I just spoke about, taking on West Ham away. This is quite interesting as well, has to be said. And before the start of the season, I could have bet my house on Liverpool winning this. But they played, of course, in the Champions League this week. And I mentioned that impressive win over Real Madrid, but they followed it up with a 4-1 defeat against PSV Eindhoven. I mean, what is that on the slot? What is going on? As well as that, Hugo Ekitike picking up an injury, one of their best players at the minute, in my opinion, at least. It just gets worse. But I still actually don't think it's bad enough for them to lose against West Ham, because West Ham had a few good performances at home, and maybe that's what's going for them here on Sunday. They beat Newcastle, but Newcastle aren't good away. They beat Burnley 3-2 at home, and like I said, Burnley is one of the worst teams in the league, and they still conceded 2 there and had a narrow game. And they drew against Bournemouth, but conceded 4 expected goals and only managed to create like one, less than one, I think, on their own. So I think their chickens are coming home to roost here, I reckon. And even though Liverpool don't have any sort of form at the minute, I think it's not bad enough to not get a result here. What will the result be exactly? Of course, hard to predict, but I'm gonna back Liverpool and predict a 2-1 away win here. And then lastly, to close out the game week, we had the biggest game here of the entire round. It's Chelsea taking on Arsenal at home. And of course, Arsenal first in the table and Chelsea second, so it doesn't get much more interesting than this. I would actually say that both of these teams have a case of being the two best teams in Europe, not even England at the minute, because the only two teams I would have held above them would have been Barcelona on form and Bayern Munich. And as you know, Chelsea beat Barcelona very, very convincingly in the week, and Arsenal, I'm not going to say cruise because that's a bit disrespectful, but they beat Bayern Munich without anyone being able to blame it on luck or anything else. So this is a really, really intriguing matchup here. And coming into the season, I would have favored Arsenal, but now I'm a bit unsure. And of course, they are favorites with the bookies, but Chelsea shouldn't really be underestimated here. I did think before that Barcelona game, their record was a bit deceiving because although they had a lot of wins, there were rarely any wins over good opposition there. And when they did face better teams, they did tend to lose. But dominating Barcelona is incredibly impressive. So, will Arsenal be able to wash them like they washed Tottenham? Absolutely not, in my opinion. Can they manage to get the result here? Of course they can. I do, however, expect Arteta to almost be satisfied with the draw, though, and that might not pave for the best kind of game for the neutral here. Because as we know, when Arsenal took on City at home, even they played for a draw, and when City scored, they struggled to equalize. Chelsea, of course, can't be disappointed with a draw against the best team in the league. However, if they want to be serious in this title race, 3 points here would be extremely important. So I hope that just someone goes for this and it doesn't turn out to be like a stalemate. In terms of predictions, it's really quite difficult, I think. But Arsenal just dominating Tottenham and then Bayern Munich, that's just on its own too much for me to go against them. And even though Gabriel and Jokeres are likely to be out injured, Gabriel we know, Jokeres is a bit in doubt, but Arsenal are just too good. And Chelsea very impressive against Barcelona, but not, in my opinion, at the level of Arsenal. So I'm actually going to go with the 2-1 away win for the Gunners here to close out the game week. So those are my final predictions for the 13th round of the Premier League. Keep your eye out for the Tottenham versus Fulham London derby on Saturday night. I expect it to be very entertaining. Also, I recommend that you watch the Forest versus Brighton game because I do think that we're going to see some quite high level of football on display there, especially when you look at their form. And of course, to wrap up the game week, the banger between the two best teams in England and probably in Europe right now, Chelsea taking on Arsenal. Thank you guys a lot for listening, and I'll catch you next time.